I think that's what's really exciting about this is that it's actually, we're moving to a kind of more collaborative approach across the sector here. You know, we've got multiple actors who are looking beyond their immediate asset and saying, how do we have a functioning landscape? And, you know, we've also got a bunch of farmers now looking beyond their own hedges or fence boundaries or whatever it might be and saying, how do we have a functioning landscape together as farmers?
Tim Coates, Tim Fields, welcome to the Rebalancers podcast. From now on, for our listeners who do not have the pleasure of viewing us on YouTube, Tim Coates, you're going to be Tim C.
Sure.
Tim Field, you're going to be Tim F. So, welcome to the podcast again. To start off, could you please introduce yourselves and give us a little bit of background on your story, please?
After you, Tim F.
Oh, thank you very much, TC. So I'm an ecologist by background and particularly interested in freshwater environments and the farmed environment. And then I went on and did a land management and surveyors course as well. So that interaction between business and land management and ecology is my background. And then 4 years ago, set up a farmer group. And that's how we got to this place.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm from a family farming background, so third generation farmer in the Cotswolds, and but alongside that, a career in financial services. So I did economics as an original degree, and those two things sort of have converged along at various points, or not converged, but converged most recently, sort of 7 years ago, when I co-founded a bank called Oxford Bank, which was a bank for farmers because the UK was lacking one. And then the cluster came along, and I became a director of that in due course as we set off on the landscape recovery project.
So the cluster you're referring to is the Northeast Cotswold Farmer Cluster.
That's right, yeah. The Northeast Cotswold Farmer Cluster, indeed, yeah.
Indeed. So tell us about this cluster.
Well, I think really, TF, you should start that because you were there right at the beginning. I came along in the second act.
It started off as a conversation between a few of the farms. Back in those days, I was working for an organic farm and food business, and focused right in the middle of the River Even Lode Valley. There were a few farmers wanting to get their produce to market a bit more efficiently and collaboratively, but it didn't really kick on because it's hard to crack the nut of supply chains as a group. But then there were a few more farms that came around and said, let's join up some wildflower meadows and restore the river and start to do some agri-environment schemes together, some habitat creation and so on. And that was something which galvanised a few more farms. And then I left my previous job and set up a soil carbon testing business and needed a few farmers to try this landscape scale approach to. And so I sort of took the reins slightly voluntarily. But then it snowballed. It spiraled. And then we met, I think one of the first events that we did, funnily enough, it was an infiltration test in the middle of a field that wasn't really working because it was absolutely hosing it down with rain. And yeah, Tim joined.
Started to go, that water will disappear eventually.
It wasn't our finest farm walk moment, but it was funny because it was moments like that brought the cluster together, that nucleus that needed to snowball from.
And Tim C., from your perspective as a farmer, third generation farmer, what is it about this cluster that enabled some of those farmers to say, let's collaborate, and then inspired others to do? What is it that was special about that cluster that made it happen?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of exceptionalism going on. Like it's a really, in farming sense, a very diverse mix. It's not very diverse in every other meaning of that word, but it is. There's a lot of there's actually quite a good age range, which is nice. There's quite there's a reasonable gender split actually for again in a farming context, and there's quite a lot of people who are quite innovative and want to push things hard in a certain direction and what they're passionate about. And then we're incredibly lucky because we do have a farming centre of excellence right slap bang in the middle. So that's Farm Ed, set up by Ian Wilkinson with the help of John T. Brunye. So 2 farmers in our cluster, right? And they had this vision, and Ian and his wife had this vision, and they created this amazing centre, which was due to open, and then along comes COVID. but thankfully that didn't damage what they've managed to achieve there, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that. But suddenly you have this beacon, and I think it's just a very obvious thing for people to circle round and go, well, actually, there's a place now for us all to go and talk farming, which is which isn't the pub. Which is an improvement. So yeah, and in fact, the first formal meeting happened there, didn't it?
Absolutely, and it's interesting when you think farming groups evolve naturally and organically, and they're very diverse in the structure and so on. But having Farm Ed during COVID, when we were sort of desperate to get together and socialise a little bit, albeit 2 meters apart.
No pubs, you see.
We were able to convene this group in a location right in the middle of the heart of the cluster, and it gave it an element of formality. And there are some brilliant brains amongst our farming group, like Jonty, who was very good at sort of facilitating a conversation around strategy and vision and mission and objectives. And actually, that little bit of formality gave us a seed to then go on and kick on with various projects and knowledge exchange. So it really did get going from that meeting we had at Farm Ed.
Yeah, it's quite good. It's a meeting where actually everyone said, what should the 5-year strategy be? What were our objectives? That's this formality came along quite quickly. I mean, we're now at the point where we're going, right, what's the next 5 years hold? Because on some of those, we feel like we're doing quite well with respect to agri-environment and that part of things. But as Tim was saying, we kind of still haven't forgotten some of the original things that we really want to do, which are in some senses harder, maybe. we'll see. Around food supply chain.
So there is this by farmers, for farmers. It's very local. You have, let's say, quite a structured approach. It's not just, let's meet to the pub. We've got a dedicated center right in the center where we can discuss formulate those 5-year strategies. Is that what would you say is what led from it moved from 10 farms to 160 farms?
Well, I think the thing that did that was, again, it was slightly, this is COVID time, right?
Yeah.
And the farmers have always been interested in what other farmers are doing, let's call it that.
Okay.
And then you've suddenly got a bit of structure and we say, hey, we're going to hold events where we go to this farm to talk about this topic. And each one of those, more and more people kept turning up. And, a very simple membership strategy of it's free. So come on. And, it was I think there was that desire to get out there, socialise and think about what's happening. And of course, in the background, you've had a huge policy change. And I'm sure we'll touch on that a bit more. So there was even more reason for everyone to come together and say, what are we all going to do about, the new normal that we find ourselves in? And there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think that really helped it grow and grow and grow to the sort of 170 odd now it is today, covering 55,000 hectares.
Yeah.
So hyperlocal, well, it's sprawling.
Yes.
It's still sort of within the character area, but it's got some very the furthest away are now quite far away from each other, but yet they can still come back to the centre.
Yeah.
And there's always innovation and learning happening there, but there's also innovation and learning happening on all the different farms as well.
And so how did the Landscape Recovery Project come out of this?
Well, I told you we had to, didn't I?
There were a couple of, there were a couple of, well, I've been involved in the setting up of Elms from the Michael Gove days, and so I'd always had my eye on this third tier. I thought that would be amazing. But we were very junior, as a farmer group. There were some really well-established farm groups around, and the Wildlife Trusts and RSPBs and so on, National Trusts, who just, you assumed they were going to take on this landscape scale. Rewilding was being coined a lot back at that stage. And I remember a couple of members, the one sitting next to me particularly, just saying, we've got to do this because we've got some brilliant case studies, and there's been some brilliant work by the Evenlake Catchment Partnership to date as well, doing sort of case study wetland creation and so on. We had this mentality of like improvement of how can I be more environmentally friendly, but also more business resilient, diversify and so on. And Tim was like, we've just we've got to do this.
Yeah. And I had some slightly strange things going on in my head at the same time, as well as all of that, which was I'd gone into the SFI pilot, which was the sort of lower tier. I already had the countryside stewardship kind of arrangement. I was like, God,
What's the
sustainable farming incentive? So there was a pilot for that. So I was one of the 800 and so pilot farms for that policy, and that's the sort of bottom rung of ELMS. And then there's countryside stewardship in the middle, and then landscape recovery on top. And I already had the countryside stewardship piece, and I was like, God, it'd be nice to be the first farm to have done all three. So I'll admit that's the first time I told you that one. But also, more seriously, I was also like, actually, if this works as a policy, and we can show that it can be done in lowland England, right in the centre, in a kind of complicated sort of peri-urban environment with a vast number of participants, all these farmers collaborating together, well then kind of anywhere else in the country hasn't really got an excuse to also get on and do it.
And that was exactly the thing that we were both thinking. It's like, this should not be the reserve of single estates or big barren areas of low productive agriculture. This, if we want genuine nature recovery, has to infiltrate through the whole of England.
Exactly. And be done by farmers who are also productive. Like the false dichotomy of, you've got the environment or food production, like has to be disproven. And that was a very strong driver.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that. But just before that, what is the perception of nature-based solutions among farmers? Is this something which is like, yeah, we understand it, it's just as a new term that's being used, we've always applied it? What is their perception of NBS?
I'm going to start, and then you can do the proper answer. I don't think there's an appreciation by probably 70 to 80% of farmers. That may be a complete generalization. I think we've got quite a, dare I say it, sophisticated group of farms in our area, by their understanding that a lot of adoption of SFI and so on. I'm not sure that everyone, and I don't think all the farm advisors, I think there's an awful lot of understanding still to be done on nature-based solutions. You give the complete answer.
I think it's really simple. Is that I think they're probably not using that phrase, but some of what it then leads to and what the interventions might be, and the concept of a resilient landscape, that's there. But as you were talking about, not just farmers, but also their advisory. So whether that's their solicitor or their land agent or their accountant, or whatever. Actually, you've got to remember the context economically that we're talking about here, which is every single farm is marginal at best, generally. Right.
What do you mean by marginal?
Economically marginal.
Right.
Like, are they going to make a profit that year?
Right.
Probably not. And that's why it's a subsidized industry, you could argue. The context there is this nature-based solutions, or whatever people might be calling it, nature-friendly farming, regenerative agriculture. Does it pay? Because actually that's the question it comes down to. And so as part of what we've been doing with the Landscape Recovery Project, we had to go, yes, it does, and this is how it will. But so that's been a huge education journey as well. And if you can show that it pays, we're off.
But let me challenge this. I mean, surely, you're third generation farmer. Your first generation were applying nature-based solutions.
There's a lot of chat about when you talk about regenerative agriculture. So it's, what Grandad used to do. Yeah, there's a lot of that. Yeah,
exactly.
And there's it's the concept of what is progress, right?
Okay.
And progress, unfortunately, in the more recent decades, has been about output. Has not been about stewardship in a kind of continuous way. And by that I mean almost in the way continuous is used in a kind of biodiversity sense, i.e., you've kind of got this land sharing, land sparing rather than sharing kind of approach. It's like, I've got my productive areas here and my not productive areas there. And so these things have moved apart rather than being considered as part of a whole ecosystem. So when I came back to the farm and it became my privilege and problem, because it's both of those things, that was my view. It's like, actually, what does this mean as an ecosystem as a whole? Systems-based thinking about it. And actually, you can't do that arable practice over there or that livestock practice over there and this bit of woodland management over here and forget about that ditch or overly aggressively address that stream, right? That doesn't work. You have to think about how all these things start interacting together.
But where do you get the advice for that? Because you just said, the advice that farmers get isn't supportive of nature-based solutions, and 70 to 80% of farmers don't really adopt it. But what was successful about your cluster was kind of the word of mouth is getting the others. How much information is being shared?
Again, it's the demonstration effect.
Right.
Actually, we've got because we've had, as Tim referenced, 10 years of the Evenload Catchment Partnership doing specific interventions to do with the river.
Yeah,
and that's quite powerful. And various, there are various individual farmers who have done specific things or have not stopped doing specific things, right?
I think there's a lot in the demonstration.
Yeah.
More than 50% is in demonstration, but I think you can demonstrate things and sell it and be enthusiastic about it. But actually, the material benefits are hard to see or easily disproved. So I think there's a key element here where having the right research or academic rigor behind it as well is really important. So we're very fortunate to have very strong partnerships with the likes of the Open University and the Floodplain Meadow Partnership, the Rothamsted Research Institute, and Oxford University's Leverhulme Centre, and GWCT's Allerton Project. There's some brilliant support that we get on the ground, and when you start to build up that those case studies, everyone wants to come and talk about it, not just the farmers, but also the sort of supporting researchers, and then and so it's got to have that rigor behind it, and we've been very lucky, and also with some engineers, environmental consultancy firms, Atkins Realis particularly, getting involved in a lot of the modelling side, and that helps to build the confidence, not just in the beneficiaries, but also in the farmers as well, that actually. We can tell them a straight river isn't great for flooding, re-wiggle it till we're blue in the face. But going back to how their grandfathers farmed, it was all about straightening the rivers.
Yeah.
Because that's a very old practice now, right?
Yeah.
I won't go into some of the comments we still get about dredging, but but it's really important to think about that. I do think the demonstration effect is really impactful. And again, back to a lot of the farm walks we've organised have even if the joy of that is you can go and talk about a specific topic, but still you're going around someone's farm, and so something else is going on that people observe, and I'll start asking questions about. So even if you've gone to talk about cattle management, someone's going to start asking about the ditches or the woodland or why have you planted that over there or whatever. And so it happens sort of organically, for lack of a better word, in terms of the curiosity, I think. Yeah. I think that, to go back to what Tim was saying about that sort of 70% who aren't thinking about nature-based solutions, one thing farmers are inherently, I think, is really curious, and just naturally, I think the personality type is quite innovative and definitely entrepreneurial. It's a support mechanism that's needed to kind of encourage people to go in slightly new directions.
So to go into those new directions, and coming back to your comment about dealing with flooding, you straighten it, you re-wiggle it. I want to get practical and understand what role do healthy soils have in terms of plus floodplain restoration to protect farms better than, let's say, concrete culverts. And let's talk about the demonstration effect. Can you give us some examples?
Probably where we started this whole interview, actually, is was where we met in a field demonstrating infiltration rates in a rainstorm. That, as I said at the beginning, I started this stage of my career setting up a soil carbon business with Rothamsted Research Institute and called Carbon Quester, and we started taking soil cores and building that picture of soil carbon stocks across the landscape and 22 different soil types and land uses and so on. And that was a really valuable data set to benchmark each other, your own farms, different areas of the farm and so on, and then the farm within the landscape. And then weaving that into some modelling, natural flood management modelling that we had done by Atkins Realis a few years ago. We've actually parameterized that modelling using the soil carbon data, so we can actually make some tangible predictions on how much water is going to be stored through healthier soils. And that is through deeper rooting plants and lays, and better structure, winter cover. The more soil carbon in the soil, the less the density, the more like a sponge, and it's creating this landscape scale sponge. And it's it's the combination of having someone like John Storkey from Rothamsted standing up with his academic, agroecologist for however many years, 30 years at Rothamsted. He's standing up there with some brilliant slides and explaining it beautifully how the soil carbon makes the soil health respond, and then going out and looking at it in the field, a field that has been hard to work because it's the particular clay soil type, it's down in the floodplain. Then it went into a Thames Water cover cropping trial. So they sponsored some trials for cover cropping. Halfway down the field, a split. One half cover cropped, the other half wasn't. And it's this kind of curiosity that Tim mentions. You go out in the field and you're wading around the cover crops and you do infiltration tests. Okay, it didn't work that day.
The wrong day.
But it was the wrong day. But it's that curiosity. And then all of a sudden the penny is dropping. That field became much easier to work and get a crop established after it was in the cover crop and so on.
Something about that data set that Tim referred to again was really interesting because there was 41 farms in that data set of the cluster and multiple fields sampled. And because you can say, well, if you were lazy, you'd say, well, we're all on Cotswold brash with a bit of clay in the valleys, right? It's a bit more complicated than that, which is great. Thanks to Rothamsted and Tim for explaining that to us all as farmers. That then says, actually, this field over here is this basic same soil type as that field, all over there on that different farm. And here's the management practice difference, and here's the soil organic carbon difference. And then you do that, multiple samples across multiple farms, across multiple sites. So you've got a really rich data comparison set, and you kind of go, well, actually, if I adopt that practice, it could look like that. And this isn't just about chasing a number and being competitive, although a bit of competition is never a bad thing. We also get competitive about bird counts in the cluster. But it's really indicative because you go, actually, because soil organic carbon is such an important predictor of general soil health, and therefore such an important predictor of output, which we do care about as farmers. We want healthy crops and plenty of them, right, in a cropping sense.
And Tim, just to interrupt you rapidly here, for our listeners who are not seeing you on the video, can you describe in as much detail what does a healthy soil looks like, smell like, feel like? Trying to wake the senses of our listeners.
Okay, of course.
Compared to
a health, what is a healthy health? A healthy soil is, as Tim said, it's spongy to walk on. So if we even got to, if you're on it, there's give in it, and that actually is kind of whatever the weather.
Yeah,
quite important thing. And then if you were to dig up a kind of cube of soil, let's say, which wouldn't be bare because you don't want to leave bare soil. So it's got rooted plants. You want to see, you would want a diversity of species in there. Different root lengths, and I'm going to get all the technical terms wrong, but that doesn't suppose you can tell me what they all are, Tim. It should be aggregates, so it should be quite a complex structure, lots of aeration clearly evident in it as well. So it's not compact; it shouldn't have obvious clear layers to it. It should be really nicely sort of smooth because those layers are indications of compaction and lack of oxygen cycling. So you don't want to see that. And it really will have a smell to it, right?
Exactly,
which is earthy, unsurprisingly, right? But that's what it is. But it's not. It's almost got a slight sweetness to it, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. Which I'm sure there's a good scientific explanation for what that is. Don't know. But you would also see the soil sort of in a very nice way clumping around the roots.
Yeah.
Don't forget the most important macroinvertebrate of all as well.
And I was coming to that. I'm just talking about the sea. And then of course that's supposed. And then. Yeah, clearly the most important macroinvertebrate, of course, are the earthworms, of which there are actually many varieties, and they will be depending on where you're in the soil. There'll be different levels, and actually, you're interested in how many there are in a kind of area sense, but also in depth in different species. And actually, you should be able to see evidence of other microfauna as well. Yeah. And that's it's alive, bluntly.
Yeah.
Whereas it's very easy, actually, again, by comparison, and I've done this in my own field, with different test strips of various things. You can go and put a spade down in one bit and come and go, this is dead earth.
Yeah,
bluntly, it's nothing. It's particularly where I am. That means it's quite sandy. Pick up and you have to fall apart. It's nothing like what I was just trying to describe.
You did a very good job.
Thank you.
And let's switch tracks now, and let's look at it from the financial perspective, because you said earlier on, whatever a farmer does, he needs to ensure that at least the farm breaks even and make a little bit profit. How does NBS stand up in terms of cost effectiveness?
I think, well, first step is a bit of a mindset shift, which is the other way of bringing people into being interested, which is about risk management and resilience, right? So you are not going to make any money off a field if it washes your crop away, if your crop gets washed away. That's not going to happen. So at one extreme, that's something you want to manage the risk of. Likewise, if you get a different kind of weather year and you get an extreme drought, you want your soils to have been alive and full and acting as that sponge to provide water in that drought season. Otherwise, again, you're going to suffer. And I'm just talking in a cropping sense here, but this obviously leads to growing of grass for raising of livestock as well. So that sort of risk management, resilience piece, really important. And then it's into, okay, well, what's happened is we've been really busy maximizing output and we have been taking advantage of nature's bounty and degrading the soils generally and other facets of the natural environment, which means that it's becoming harder and harder to get the same result. Okay, so I'm trying to not get into the bigger picture here, just in a very narrow sense. So we don't like that direction of travel. It's becoming more expensive because you're throwing more chemistry at the problem, which generally also then makes the problem worse over time. So this is all, they've got to put the brakes on that. Huge cost inflation in those things and go, right, a regenerative approach, restoring that soil health and restoring the ecosystems around it, can stop that downward spiral and move back towards profitability. So that's in a very general sense. Now, you can then get into some really interesting things about, okay, if we talk about nature-based solutions, what kind of things? Well, the landscape scale one's about managing water, because it generally has to be done at a landscape scale. We'll manage some of that, although the infield will help with the drought situation. But then, healthy hedgerows and pollinator margins and varieties of in-crop activity and companion cropping, that's creating a much more resilient. That's a nature-based solution as well, right? And planting trees, which is something I have a bit of an obsession with, and hedges to manage everything from water flow through to increasing biodiversity to increasing carbon drawdown. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that came to that last because actually that's the bit which society's working up and going, yeah, we care about that quite a lot now. The wider society hasn't really got too interested in what's going on in the farmers sort of in the crop, how much money they're making. But they're saying, actually, we really need to do something about drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere. Yeah. And the best technology that we've got for that, because it's been tested for millions of years, for plants, particularly trees. That's actually, those are nature-based solutions to the problem that we face globally.
And I guess they help, address the issues of climate change, which farmers are facing.
We're on the vanguard of that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We suffer first.
Yeah.
And in the UK, we don't suffer the worst first, but we are suffering.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because going back to my comment that most farmers aren't understanding what nature-based solutions are, and it is purely down to a terminology. Yeah. But actually, we can take a group of farms to look at a floodplain where the scour from the river has scoured straight through the crop and showed how actually tweaks in management or land use change, and all of a sudden slight tweak in farm business activity, and you can still produce food off that field and provide nature-based solutions. The nature-based solutions are co-benefit to that farmer's mindset. Likewise, another example, floodplain reconnection, the drought, 2 years ago, the whole estate, big estate, went completely brown. The shepherd had eaten every bite of grass off the whole estate, except the one field that had the floodplain reconnection, which was still green.
Yeah.
And it's, that floodplain reconnection is providing water quality benefits and flood storage for downstream communities. But that shepherd doesn't understand that. He understands that he's got a bite of grass when every other bit's burnt off. Yeah. And I think there's other examples where, there's soil scour coming. The latest storm Bert in our area really dumped a lot of water in a very short space of time. There's a lot of scour down some of the slopes through the arable fields. But healthy hedgerows, the occasional field corner bund, scrape, better margins and so on, those are all helping reduce the soil scar activity in that field. So those nature-based solutions are just a simple way of trying to maintain those farming assets which are producing the food for that farmer and a better margin with those co-benefits.
Exactly. It's interesting because, in economic terms, we would talk about the fact that we've got all of these negative externalities that have resulted from the farmed environment, given the economic incentives farmers have been given, right? That's not, I don't want to load it all up as saying it's farmers just going out and being reckless, because people have said, this is what we want. The markets have said that. Governments have said that. Policies said that. So the real shift comes when, economies and governments say, actually, what we want is this as well, please. Everyone wants food production. We've all got quite a vested interest in that one. But we also now need to recognise the co-benefits of farming and managing the land in a certain way. And why is that really? Well, because these co-benefits or nature-based solutions or ecosystem services, whatever terminology you want to use, are becoming scarce, and therefore they're becoming valuable. And not having them is actually really, really costly to a whole range of actors, including then individual farms, but also the farms, downstream in some senses compared to, I happen to sit at the top of the catchment, and I like to think some of the things I'm doing are helping my fellow farmers further down the stream, as well as everyone else in society further down the stream in terms of flood management and water quality and so on.
So I want to double click on this whole point about farmers' incentive, because my understanding is that since the Second World War, farmers have been heavily incentivized food production,
Exactly.
food production. Yeah. And thus there is this historical reluctance to take land out of production to focus it in terms of nature-based solutions. But as you said, nature-based solutions are becoming valuable because there's so little of them left.
Well, I'll give you a very real example, right? So in terms of on my farm, there is an area of what is historic parkland. So it's registered under Historic England, right? And that was a glorious piece of wood pasture, which is a really important habitat for a whole range of reasons. And in 1945, someone got the plough out, right? Because the post-war directive was maximise production.
Yeah.
And they didn't just get the plough out, but they started taking the trees out, started taking the hedges out, all of that. So it's a bit of my mission now to start restoring that gradually, and landscape recovery is one enabling factor for that. But it's exactly that incentive, and you've got that kind of story everywhere. Trees grubbed out, hedges grubbed out, lands that, for me, when I'm on the farm, I spend quite a lot of time trying to think, what is the landscape trying to tell me? Which might seem a bit sort of mystical, but it's not. It's like, actually, we've got so much good data for this kind of thing now. It's like that area just is not giving me the output it should. Why? What's going on? It could be due to the geology, it could be the hydrology, it could be a whole range of factors. But fundamentally, this is a field or an area of a field that's saying, don't try and crop me, please.
There's a lovely saying that one of our farm advisors that comes along quite often says is the Cotswolds were the last to go into arable, it will be the first to come out of arable.
Right.
The Cotswold, the wool churches, the beautiful churches through the Cotswold towns, the market towns, all built on the back of the wool industry and the Cotswold sheep and the wool trade, and great grass.
Yeah.
Less good arable on those slopes and thin soils. That's not to say we've got to get rid of all arable. Yeah. It's about refinding that balance, and then we'll get to some kind of sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely. And just, again, I've got that very expensive. So now I've huge areas which some people might say out of production. Well, they're not out of production; they're back to grass, and the sheep are doing well on them. That's great. We're right in the middle of the country, as I sort of said earlier, right? And so that kind of sort of slightly classic east-west divide you get in UK agriculture of heavy livestock on the grasses in the west where it's wet and there's more topography compared to the east where it's nice and flat and drier and more arable. So we are right in the middle, and we can have a mixed environment, and we should have a mixed environment and an integrated environment. But it's not going to look like it did 50 years ago or 70 years ago.
Yeah, and bringing this balance back that you're mentioning and coming back to the farmers' incentives, how should farmers be compensated for repurposing their land in a way that nature-based solutions can come back?
You give one answer. I'll give
Yeah,
another.
okay. A lot of people would say that that's the role of government, and the government of the moment seems a bit confused about what it wants from its agricultural policy that it inherited from the previous government, which obviously was the first post-EU policy package. I think this goes back to what we value as a society, right? In terms of which ecosystem services matter. I mean, they all do. It's a complicated system. And I think it's the eventual and starting emergence of those who benefit realizing they can't free ride on this anymore, because if they do, we'll end up with the tragedy of commons and there'll be nothing. So it's the emergence of markets, one, but then the important thing, and I think what is important about what we're doing with the cluster, and particularly the landscape recovery project, is we need to find structures and aggregation and a way of bringing the scale of that to market on the supply side to meet the huge demand that is there, even if it can't quite articulate itself. It's not just about the farmers' incentives, it's the incentives of all those other actors now in the economy, because this is a land use question. Fundamentally, we go, yes, provisioning service of food, really important. Okay, good, let's bake that one in. But actually, we also need, as I say, carbon sequestration. Yeah, we're starting to get used to that. Oh, actually, biodiversity is quite important, like life systems support, quite important. Water management, incredibly important. Flooding management, drought management, water quality. I mean, we should touch briefly on the quality of or lack thereof of the water in our catchment. But all of these things are being, as I say, increasingly valued. And there needs to be a way for farmers who steward that land to be incentivized to manage it in a way that creates positive externality, and then compensated for that.
I think the true cost accounting of the food part will help that. But understanding the beneficiaries, the key beneficiaries, is
I just I completely agree on that true cost accounting approach. The difficulty with that is that there is no ability for the price mechanism for food to shift the volume of financial capital that's needed into natural capital, because the end consumer can't tolerate what that true price would be.
Yeah, exactly. So you need
it would be too high.
It would be way too high, which would be unpalatable to the whole market. Consumers wouldn't be able to pay for it in general. Retailers wouldn't be able to therefore stomach that position. In a very competitive retail market, and of course, government policy is not going to get very happy about anything that's going to drive food prices up for various obvious reasons.
Yeah. And so we touched about some of the emerging business models. Do you want to maybe spend a little bit more time? Are we looking at, for example, blended finance? Are we looking at payment for ecosystem services, carbon sequestration? What are some of the emerging business models that you're seeing, and how has these influenced the funding for the Even Load Landscape Recovery Project?
If I touch on a couple of examples, live examples we've got designed out at the moment, and then Tim, you could perhaps look at the mechanisms. But so we've got three or four very important infrastructure utilities companies in the catchment that we've been working very closely with. The Cotswold line runs along the Cotswold Railway line runs along the River Even Load and crosses it about 27 times.
Wow.
In 2007, it washed out. When I say washed out, the embankment literally washed out with floating railway lines in about 7 or 8 places down that line, and that's a very, very costly repair job. The dwell time of the trains, and so on. So the river, through its history of being straightened and the energy being channeled down the river, when it really floods, it can cause an awful lot of damage. So Network Rail have been very proactive in piloting a new approach to investing outside of their assets, outside of their red line boundaries, in those nature-based solutions to reduce the energy and the flood risk from the Even Load, and reducing the damage that it would do on the line. So thereby reducing the dwell time and the cost of trains being delayed, reducing the cost of maintenance, even simple things of getting an engineer along every year to check that the embankment's still sound. When we start planting trees in the right places and reconnecting the river and allowing it to flood in certain places, there's a really measurable benefit to Network Rail. So we've been developing that. Likewise with the water company that suffers from surface flow events inundating the treatment works and causing problems with water quality. I mean, there's all sorts of problems with the water quality, but we feel that there is a cost-effective solution in some areas where we can deliver outcomes of holding that water back, and also potentially some constructed wetlands to help polish give it tertiary treatment, the final sort of treatment to get that water quality to the level it should be, rather than accepting poor water quality. And then there's the other infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, the communities, and the electricity networks as well, the DNOs. And so they're all able to participate in these nature-based solutions through the even load. And that's where Tim and colleagues have been creating some brilliant structure to enable that.
Yeah, it's the thing is that what's really good, and I think it goes off the previous bit of conversation we were talking about, is those actors, like, you know, those big asset owners have, you know, worked, lots of very competent, clever engineering and other type professionals have worked out that these assets are massively at risk, and that they need to intervene, and they need to intervene in a way that's not just throwing more money at maintaining a problem, because we've got, you know, it's climate adaptation, mitigation, and in a rapidly worsening situation, particularly with respect to flooding. And there's some really some good examples of that in practice, and all the conversations we've been having. And the district network operator, as you mentioned them, you know, which is SSEN in our area, they've already worked out that the cost benefit to them of the nature-based solution for protecting a substation from flooding, i.e. investing with the farmer in the field or surrounding it, rather than trying to, you know, put concrete immediately around it and manage that, it's 10 times more cost effective.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and that's before, and then also because, you know, we're in the economy we are now, they've also worked out that's before you even get to the carbon cost of it. So
Right.
pouring concrete, quite reasonably carbon intensive.
Exactly.
Nature-based solutions. Oh wait, carbon positive, negative, whichever way you want to do the accounting. So actually, there's benefits there as well. So they're kind of recognising the co-benefits as well as the pure financial cost. And that's what's really good and exciting. I think that's what's really exciting about this, is that it's actually, we're moving to a kind of more collaborative approach cross sector here. You know, we've got multiple actors who are looking beyond their immediate asset, and saying, how do we have a functioning landscape? And, you know, we've also got a bunch of farmers now looking beyond their own hedges or fence boundaries or whatever it might be, and saying, how do we have a functioning landscape together as farmers, both ecologically but also economically, because they do start then to intertwine. And so then when we were putting together the concept for a business model for the landscape recovery project, we said, well, hey, there's going to be this huge range of ecosystem service benefits because we're operating at a landscape scale. And we've talked about those, you know, water quality, carbon sequestration, etc. And there will be these key actors who will be really more interested in one than the other, but they're interested in everything. As a result of being sort of interested in everything, there's lots of routes to market, actually. That's just about contractual arrangement with each of those. And that's been, so we basically want things to be quite fungible here. Okay. This isn't about saying, hey, this is a carbon project or this is a biodiversity net gain project for a habitat bank. This is saying, actually, we are going to restore the functioning of a landscape. There will be lots of benefits, and there will be actors who will pay for those benefits.
And how do you avoid the free rider problem?
You can't avoid it completely.
Yeah.
But because you have some people, you know, I think the network rails are such a specific example. It's like that is their asset, and only they can do something about the fact that their asset is being damaged by the river. Well, it's not true. They reach out to those who are in the landscape to do something about it. So does that mean then the residents of Oxford, who are less likely to get flooded, are free riding on that? A little bit. Okay, so we're not going to avoid completely the free rider problem under this model. I think there are models for the future, for another conversation maybe, which can address that, but I don't think we're there today. But the point is that this is kind of is there enough value that means that what we're doing is investable, right? So we can generate enough revenues such that we can afford to make all of these changes. In fact, when we will make a surplus on that, which means that if someone wants to fund that, they will get a return. And now we're talking the language of any financial actor, right? So suddenly, you know, you don't even have to care if you don't want to about the ecosystem service or, you know, the improvement to the landscape. You can just go, is that going to give me 10%? Yes, it is. right, great, I'm in.
But
And that's a big change.
But here you've got multiple stakeholders. You got multiple farmers. You got multiple beneficiaries who, let's say, who want to engage, who want to pay. What stops, let's say, Network Rail say, I'm just going to do it on my own and we'll work with some of the farmers? And how do you create this whole package into an investable one?
Yeah.
Well, I could tell you they're not organised enough. I mean, we are piloting some great things with Network Rail and to a degree Thames Water as well. And what's really interesting, it's a question of scale. We have broken through to farmers in our valley that have always locked the gate behind them when they see Network Rail coming,
Right.
and have got a poor relationship. And that's not because Network Rail are tricky to work with or anything. They're a lovely bunch of guys, I'm sure, but it's just things haven't been done particularly sensitively in every instance, and so we've been able to broker that relationship much more effectively. But also in some of those, the reason it's a question of scale, some of those instances we can carve out the different beneficiaries within a sort of subcatchment of the Evenlode. So a very specific location, whether that's Moreton Marsh flood group and the community that get flooded there, or the Longborough wastewater treatment works, or the section of line just down from Moreton, all sort of beneficiaries that we can actually bring into the conversation and sort of carve out who's winning here, who's gaining. And when you get that sort of critical number of the beneficiaries around the table, it becomes much easier to get the momentum, and then you can start to scale. So we've sort of broken the catchment down by 10 subcatchments and looking at the benefits of various interventions we're doing through landscape recovery on those bits of infrastructure and communities. So I can't see the flood groups and the Network Rails and the Thames Waters all working behind closed doors and then coming to us, bypassing us, should I say, straight to the farmers and then aggregating 64 farmers.
Yeah. Right,
But
yeah,
also
yeah.
because it's the scale point is also true about the ecosystem services, which is it's not a linear scale in terms of the benefit. Like if you address the whole catchment, you get a far better outcome than if you're trying to cherry pick off little areas. And so if Network Rail with those 27 pain points, or Thames Water with, I think, with 19 separate assets, like you want a catchment based solution, and so you need someone who's aggregated that. You need that single legal entity in the middle, which is the role that we're playing.
And for any listeners who in their own area are thinking, I want to do a catchment project, what are some of the top tips you would share to them? Because these projects take a lot of time and resources, and they would want to go to an investor and say, this is my vision, this is what I want to achieve. How would they position it to make it investable also?
I think we were lucky when we set out, because there was, as I said before, some good case studies, a little bit of data from the catchment partnership. So there's a little bit of activity already on a few farms. And once you get a couple of events and that sort of critical number of farmers listening or looking and being curious, I think as Tim says, and then you develop a project, starting with the baselining. The carbon baselining was really valuable to us, but also there was a supplementary bird feeding. So literally we produce 60 tons of bird feed and 40 farms all feeding it. And you get a common theme, interest amongst a group of 40 farms across the landscape, a common conversation, and it just enables the next baselining exercise to be that much easier. So then we went and did a load of grassland surveys. And once you got the baseline, you are then ready to think about what activities are going to be optimized for the best outcomes for the environment or best outcomes for productivity of food. And then you can have conversations with those asset owners and the markets. And
I think there's two, just to elaborate on that. I think basically there's a part of that which is actually it can start small. It's about shared objectives. So if there's another catchment that sort of someone in that catchment thinks, I need to do something about my catchment, that's great. Well, how do you collaborate with your immediate neighbours on something tangible and small that's making a difference. I mean, Salzbrook was where it all began, right?
Leinenbrook. Yeah,
But,
and there was four farms all doing something for that tiny little watercourse, but it created a principle, and that's what we started
exactly.
with.
So but then actually, is it back to that scaling? Then starts to really matter quite quickly. Like all of the other actors here, as we were saying in our previous bit of discussion, they want to face off to one thing, and a farmer cluster group or other who can enable the access and the landscape scale of solution, because actually it's the site that's what gets everyone moving, and that's everyone from asset owners that we've been talking about, like say if you're network rails or district network operators, but it's also potential funders, whether that's from the philanthropic end, through to hard-nosed financial investors who I've got some imaginary hard-nosed financial investor who doesn't care about the ecological outcome here in my head. But again, they want a simple face-off, and that's also true for government, right? And so actually starting small, but having a vision that you can get big, things will open up as well. So I think it could be a daunting prospect, but actually I think it's a journey that has logical steps to it.
And it can be. I've seen instances where a funder will come in and try and do it all at once at a big scale, and then go and find the farms.
That's not going to work.
And it doesn't work when they're trying to do community access and public access and grass restoration and floodplain reconnection and all of these different things and bit of citizen science and everything else. It takes an awful lot of work to build it all at once. It's a creation of.
And so we're going to touch a little bit on community engagement in a minute, but I just want to touch before we go to that on what role does the government can play, and specifically DEFRA?
Well, I think I was going to literally start talking about that, because I think to kudos to DEFRA and the landscape recovery policy, because it sort of it has recognised what we've just been talking about. And for them to essentially have created a development pot, which there's 22 projects in the first round and 30 odd coming behind, so 50 in total that are currently, some about to leave that development and go into implementation, and some still in that. And it's a 2-year period, and it does take that amount of time to be doing all of that organising, and a lot of it is organising. And so it's good that DEFRA has recognised that and sort of is acting in multiple ways to sort of enable the kind of things that we had started sort of organically and then have lent into heavily by going into this scheme as well. So that's been really important. I mean, as I said a bit earlier, I'm not sure quite if DEFRA knows where the rest of its sort of farming and food policy is, but this one they are adamantly at this point in time committed to. We've had a very productive relationship with fellow citizens in DEFRA, and they're doing some really important things. I mean, I won't go into any precise details because I don't think I'm supposed to. But they are providing financial support as we move into implementation to ensure that we can run this project. It's not going to just be funded by DEFRA, to be very clear, and that's one of their policy outcomes too. Is a blended finance approach, but they are providing some initial funding, and also providing really importantly a range of market underwrites for some of these markets that are sort of, we kind of know they're coming, but we kind of need something to kind of plug that gap. And that fits in with their nature markets policy framework, which they're developing at the moment, and the British Standards Institute's work on nature-based carbon and all these kind of really important policy pieces, which is sort of slotting up so that markets can evolve. It's really important they're bridging that gap. They are bridging that gap. I
think there's a bit of work in the past as well that's been very helpful, and we should mention, and that's the Farming Protected Landscape grant scheme. So a lot of the baselining and early project work and catalytic work was funded through that. It's only available through the National Landscapes. I think it was Lord Benyon that triggered that, and it's been extended for another year. But having that catalytic funding, or then testing some ideas through the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund. We've had 3 projects through that NERF, as we call it, Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund. And so these sort of catalytic seed funds from government have been really valuable. It's also got us organised to be able to also secure some more sort of philanthropic funding to do some of these exercises. And that has enabled us to then go on and evolve into landscape recovery. But so we've been quite savvy in finding funding to get us to this point, and government has played a role in that.
Excellent. So let's move down to the subject of community engagement and knowledge exchange. So, Tim F., have you ever won a skeptical farmer with a single conversation or project which clicked for them?
No.
But I think we might just be there.
I think I might, yeah. See, this is where I think it's quite important. And going back to an earlier question of how do we get from 10 to 170, this isn't about one person or one project. It's actually about the farmer to farmer. And I've never, I could hear a whole load of farmers saying that's rubbish. I've never forced anyone into anything or forced anyone to come to an event.
Yes.
All I've done as a facilitator is try and listen. Again, there's probably lots of farmers saying he doesn't listen to me. I get an awful lot of ideas from the farmer group saying, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? I'd love to hear them. I'd love to do this. I'd love to go and see that. And I try and curate that to put together an interesting sort of list of events. And that gets, hopefully, the right people there and sparks, again, this curiosity from those more skeptical to come along. And so, yes, there's always going to be that infiltration test moment that gets the conversation going. But I couldn't say there's one thing that I've done to turn someone, but I think there's lots of things through the groundswell. And there are probably 3 or 4 farmers down the catchment, and I think I'm never going to turn them. But we've had an email or 2 recently which has started to say
they're flexible.
They know what we're doing, and they're starting to show some interest.
Exactly. So there's peer-to-peer learning, and I'm guessing the Farm Ed Center is acting like a lighthouse for this knowledge exchange in some form.
Yeah, I mean that is the bricks and mortar home, if you like, of this sort of concept and the regenerative farming. But there are also some brilliant other examples as well, but that's where we come back to time and time again to meet around the table.
So there's this increase of knowledge around nature-based solutions, around regenerative farming that is happening between the farmers. How is that also happening with the Network Rail and the Thames Water? Are you seeing the same kind of knowledge base increase?
You know, I'm going to say yes, and I'm going to say wider than just those. I see it more widely in other conversations in other part of the country that I get involved in, because it's, you know, there's a spectrum of the penny having dropped.
Yeah.
some people are still holding it, and so some people have got it on the floor. You know, the water companies are very different, which is interesting given they all complain about being regulated in the same way. So clearly it's possible, Thames. But having said that, we're having some very productive conversations with people in Thames, but it's obviously a vast organisation in that particular case with some well-publicised problems.
Correct.
So let's not go into too many of the details on that. And actually then that also matters to the communities and you know, citizen scientists and campaigners. Actually, you know, fundamentally, if we want to go back to focusing on Thames and water quality, you know, there is a conversation all around the country, whatever water authority is, whatever farm environment is, about what is causing problems with our waterways, with respect to water quality in particular. And in some parts of the country, you know, it's quite easy to make the case that that's predominantly the water authority. In some cases, it might be predominantly a certain farming practice. The answer is everywhere. It's a bit of both, and of course other actors and, you know, road surface pollutants and all kinds of other things that are going on. Right, it's not just those 2 things. But that's what's really exciting. Like we're now sitting down with Thames, having productive conversations about how we're going to solve this together rather than pointing fingers at each other. I think that's really important. Like collaboration here between farmers, great, really important, but collaboration outside of the farmed environment with the actors who are also in there. We're all in the landscape together, working out what the solution is to get the best outcome, and, you know, whilst recognising important principles like polluter pays and all of that kind of thing.
And we sit in a part of the world where there are an awful lot of very worried citizens doing a lot of citizen science, and understanding these problems better than most, and so we're kept on the straight and narrow, if you like, making sure that we are delivering outcomes specific to the problems, and doing that with the community. So it's not just necessarily the actors and us as a farmer group, but also the communities are there testing the water, understanding the hydrographs, understanding the groundwater problems and the storm discharge, analysing all the data, and so it keeps us all honest. There's not going to be space for greenwashing in here. It's going to have to be outcomes rather than throwing a few.
And that's going to be those measurements, because they are measurements, are going to be really, really important in the early years. Not just keeping us honest, but actually showing that we're making the improvements and keeping us on target, and the adjustments we're going to need to make, because we'll certainly have to adjust as we go along. But actually, it's the really exciting, sometimes it's the big ambition bits. So we've got some we've got some pretty lofty ambitions at headline level. We've got some very specific lofty ambitions. I mean, we've had more than a few people laugh at us. We said, no, we want eels back in the even load. There's no, but actually, if and when we do, well, we know we've kind of done a really good job about the water quality, right? It's kind of a very obvious indicator. It's become a good habitat for this particular species again, which it used to be, right? And there are other species indicators that we've got as well. But that's the one which people keep laughing at us about.
We're rapidly running out of time, so I'm going to ask you some quick questions. So if we could fast forward to 2035, what do you see as the farmers? Do you see them using nature-based solutions in their day-to-day farming practice? What does the future look like in your mind for nature-based solutions and farmers?
Yes.
In a short answer,
yes. More complex complexity in the farmed environment in terms of ecosystems, habitats, and the role of the farmer will be quite diverse. Yeah. And I think they will be counting the skylarks and the curlews and the eels migrating. They will be delivering more than just winter wheat and oilseed rape. They will be delivering all of this habitat and the data to evidence those nature-based solutions.
And what skills will they need to be able to do that?
That's a really good question. Well, certainly how to use an app. But I think the other element that we're looking at is how do we incorporate community to deliver some of the citizen science as well, and the communities of academia as well. Not everyone wants to lean into that. That's fine. But opening up to the community to help deliver.
I think there's some hard skills and some soft skills in that. The hard skills there are certain practices that will need, in terms of management of, say, hedgerows. I'm just using a simple example. If you happen to have if you're suddenly planting a lot of hedgerows because you should, you're going to have to manage them well, and that might not be in the current skill set, or you might have to bring someone else to do that. It's a very sort of particular skill, hard skill. But actually, the soft skills are really important, and that's the willingness to open, recognize that you can open the farm gate to citizen science. That's a soft skill. Not being scared of that, but being welcoming of it. And the one we've talked about a lot, collaboration. It's like how do we work together, on these things. And I think that's the kind of continuous skill we all need to keep practicing.
And for farmers or for listeners who do not have a farm ed center next door to them, where can they learn more? Is there any books, websites, or other resources you recommend?
One word. Agricology, agricology.co.uk. That's something we founded probably several years ago now. That has got probably about 60 or 70 organisations putting case studies and literature up there. We've got a sort of hub on agricology as well, our own website. But that gives case studies from across the country, different scales, different investors, different participants. I would say agricology.
Yeah, I would like to make a brief shout out to the Pasture for Life.
Yeah,
because they actually have a lot of case studies about their members on there and the way they've integrated nature-based solutions into the farmed environment and are raising some fantastic produce altogether. Very important. I am a member, declare that interest, but I'm only a member, but because it's great and I'm very proud to be one. And I would also, because I say this every time anyone asks me about something to read, there's a wonderful book by an American who's sadly passed away called Jerry Brunetti called The Farmer's Ecosystem. and it is highly, highly technical, so you can really get your nerd on. But it is also beautifully written.
Okay.
And I would recommend it to anyone.
And my final question to you both is, who would you nominate to be a future guest on this podcast? And I'm warning you, David Attenborough has already been mentioned a few times. Who would you recommend?
You go first.
One is a tough one. I'm going to reel them off. No, I think if I was to have one, it would probably be the agroecologist from Rothamsted that I work with and has worked in the catchment, but across the country, and that's John Storkey.
Yeah.
But I could list...
You can list a lot more.
Long list.
Yeah. Just because the first person that popped into my head, I think you should speak to Archie Ruggles-Bryce at the Spainsfall Estate in Essex, who has this concept of the whole farm reservoir.
Okay.
And he also is incredibly lucky because he has beavers. And who doesn't want to talk about beavers?
Exactly. Beavers have come up quite a few times on our podcast. Well, listen, Tim and Tim, thank you so much for participating in the podcast. It's been a pleasure having you both on the show.
Thank you.